I want you to take a look at these two videos, made exactly 60 years apart. What you're about to see reveals more about today's politics than anything else right now. In 1964, a single ad changed everything.
3, 2, 1, 0.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
A little girl picking daisies, counting down innocently, until the countdown turned deadly. A nuclear blast, no names mentioned, but the message was clear. Vote wrong and the world ends. Fast forward 60 years.
If you want to avoid nuclear war, I strongly urge you to vote for Donald Trump. In fact, I would go so far as to say that a vote for Kamala Harris is a vote for nuclear war.
The stakes feel just as high, the names have changed, but the fear remains. 60 years apart, yet fear still wins elections. But why hasn't changed anything? If you think this is not relevant, just ask yourself, how many times do politicians these days try to grab more power, evoking fear, referencing an imminent threat ready to destroy your freedom? Just now in South Korea, martial law declared by the president referencing North Korean threat, an absolute blow to democracy. Hungary has been in a state of emergency for the last 3.5 years, allowing the governing party to increase control. The 47th president of the US naming the enemy
from within.
Fear from poverty, from illegal immigrants, or nuclear war. Did we throw out reason for the sake of appealing to our most basic needs? This is the story of the most important ad in history, and how fear still controls our politics. If you like this video, check out my other stuff also on historical and philosophical analysis on current affairs, and subscribe to the channel. I want to make sure that this channel is balanced in its analysis, and it's important to point out what the difference is between the ads and the context behind them. I think it's easy to dismiss political ads as simply propaganda designed to manipulate emotions. But in 1964, the fear evoked by one ad, I argue, wasn't fabricated. It was real, whereas I'll explain how the video with RFK is different. In terms of 1964, the world was gripped by the Cold War. Just 2 years earlier, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the planet closest to nuclear annihilation than ever before. Every American had seen the mushroom clouds, heard the air sirens, and wondered if they'd live to see tomorrow. This is the scenery into which Barry Goldwater entered as the presidential candidate of the GOP. A 5-term senator from Arizona, a staunch conservative and a firm believer in military strength. His foreign policy stance? Aggressive, unyielding, and unapologetically hawkish. He had a famous quote, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice." To his supporters, Goldwater was a patriot, willing to do whatever it took to defend American freedom. To his critics, he was a man who was willing to push the nuclear button. For example, Goldwater openly challenged the idea of nuclear restraint. He suggested tactical nuclear weapons could be used on the battlefield, pretty much like conventional arms such as in Vietnam, a radical departure from the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, which held that nuclear war could only end in global devastation. And to be fair, this wasn't just political theater. Americans were genuinely afraid, and Goldwater's tough rhetoric made many wonder, could he be the one to pull the trigger? This is when Lyndon B. Johnson's campaign saw an opportunity. They didn't need to exaggerate the threat. Goldwater's own words had already planted the seeds. All Johnson's team had to do was water them. Therefore, the Daisy ad wasn't just propaganda. It was a reflection of the very real fear that a Goldwater presidency could escalate into nuclear war. It worked because people believed it could happen. And perhaps they weren't entirely wrong. It was simply the last nail in their coffin. Fear drove votes in 1964, and in my opinion, it was a claim that rests on a valid threat. Goldwater wasn't clear enough on the topic, he was too hawkish and came across as reckless. Now let's take a look at the 2024 video with RFK. Without going into a deep analysis of the geopolitical realities of a nuclear war, it's important to note that yes, nuclear escalation is possible following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The so-called red line established by Russia has been crossed many times. However, it has been crossed so many times there is a separate Wikipedia page just about it. But let's see the video and its arguments.
If you want to avoid nuclear war, I strongly urge you to vote for Donald Trump. In fact, I would go so far as to say that a vote for Kamala Harris is a vote for nuclear war.
Right off the bat, this is already a fallacious reasoning called the fallacy of two choice, either or. There are many other options on the table for either side handling the conflict with Russia, but the fallacy makes it look like there is only two. Either there is full-scale nuclear war or there is nothing happening.
Here are some of my reasons for saying that. Former Vice President Dick Cheney endorsed Kamala, and she said she was honored to have his approval. Dick Cheney was the driving force behind a group called the neocons, which started the Iraq War.
Then the first reason RFK uses is Dick Cheney endorsing Kamala Harris. Let's see how he makes the connection. Dick Cheney was partly responsible for Iraq. Dick Cheney was an associate of neocon. Therefore, through his endorsement, Kamala Harris is an associate of neocon, from which he infers that this is a clear sign that the military-industrial complex is behind Kamala, whose best interest is a nuclear war.
In which the U.S. launched an unprovoked preemptive attack, the first in its history, in order to prevent Saddam Hussein from threatening the world with weapons of mass destruction. As history now shows, there were no weapons of mass destruction. It was all a neocon lie. This fraction of our military and intelligence establishment that we call the neocons, led by Dick Cheney, faked the evidence of weapons of mass destruction because they wanted a war.
He references the historical account of the Iraqi war and how the warmongers profiteered off of a war with no real threat. I think this is a rather weak argument. Among others, Vladimir Putin endorsed Kamala Harris. Ironically or not, it shows that anyone can endorse anyone else. And while it may be a potential solution, it also could mean that a Republican, such as Dick Cheney, is rather endorsing a Democrat than Trump.
Vote today for Kamala Harris is a vote for Dick Cheney, who lied to get a war started in which more than 1 million people died. Nuclear war today would mean billions of people dead. A recent study predicts that World War III will last only 73 minutes, and that in that time, 5.8 billion human beings will die.
Also, while it's logical to see why the lobbyists are interested in war, the case for global nuclear war being such a banger for profit isn't too clear. How would you exactly profit off of 5 billion people dying? This remains a contradiction in his speech. Then he goes on to claim the historical context and how the lobby group came about.
My uncle, President John F. Kennedy, confronted his own Joint Chiefs of Staff and his intelligence officials who proposed to fake the shooting down of an American civilian airliner and blame it on Cuba in order to justify a nuclear war with Russia. John Kennedy stood up to them and refused to go along.
For some reason, he's evoking JFK denying multiple times military aggression from this military-industrial complex. I don't see really how this reflects negatively on Democrats, as JFK was a Democrat, just as Kamala Harris. So if anything, we know that Democrats, during history, at least in the case of JFK, already resisted lobbying. I suspect that RFK is sort of evoking JFK's legacy because most people in the US still think of JFK as a just and rightful president. Tying himself with JFK could make it seem like it's strengthening his case for the argument against Kamala. Also, it's interesting to look at the defense budget during administrations. This is where you can see it. One thing is clear: no matter who is in office, the military industry complex will get its money. So, using this as an argument against Kamala Harris is counterproductive. It could be used just as much in Trump's case. One would have a valid argument saying, no matter who the president is, the military-industrial complex is getting richer. And you could say, well, the budget and parts of the budget are not necessarily just about military, but specifically for the nuclear effort. Which also, if you take a look at the data, shows that the Trump administration in its last period spent the same amount of money, about 28 billion or so, just as did the Biden presidency. So there is not much difference. The question is, why do fear-driven politics remain so effective, and what can we do to break this cycle? A 2020 study and broader socioeconomic research reveals that perceived threats influence political beliefs. Violence or war often aligns with right-wing preferences, emphasizing authority and national security. Economic threats like poverty or inequality lean people toward left-wing ideas seeking systemic change. This highlights an intriguing theory. Elections may hinge less on rational policy and more on primal fears at the bottom of Maslow's pyramid. If economic instability dominates, the left may gain traction. In times of war or uncertainty, the right finds favor. And it's also important to point out that fear is not just irrational, it's human. But for a democracy to thrive, it must move beyond fear, fostering informed debate and solutions that address people's concerns without exploitation. Political actors must rise to this challenge, though many seem disinterested in doing so. Thanks so much for tuning into this video. If you want to understand more about politics, history, and philosophy, subscribe to the channel where I aim to bring a balanced analysis, break down phenomenon, and craft arguments that I hope clarify things and open a meaningful discussion. As always, I was Matt, your host, and you were watching The Y Club.